Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. I'm Sally Ganga from College Coach. We've got some great guests here today on the show. Our second guest, Megan Stubendek, CEO of Arbor Bridge, which is one of our test prep partners and former head of instruction there. So she's not just the big wig, she's been down in the trenches. Will be telling us about the changes to the SAT. And I'm really as eager to learn as all of you. Our third guest is one of my colleagues, Tara Piantanita Kelly. She's a college finance expert here at College Coach, and she'll be answering some very important questions about changes to how financial aid eligibility is determined and how to decipher your financial aid award. But first, for those of you, by the way, who are watching this on video, you can already see Chris Lucier, former vice president of University of Vermont and University of Delaware, and current director of partner relationships at Orthot. Am I saying that correctly?
Orthot, Sally.
Orthot. Yeah. Okay, great. About the impact of test optional policies for students applying to public universities. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Sally. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I really am glad that you're here. For those of you listening, I was just telling Chris before we started that I'm really grateful he's on because all of us are kind of at sea here, including the colleges. You know, this landscape that for someone like me who's been doing this since, honestly, 1992, in one way or another, you know, I knew the role of test scores. I understood how they would be used. I understood test optional when it was used, but then everything changes on a dime for good reason. But suddenly things become so much harder to predict. So Chris, you can enlighten us as much as possible. What are some of the changes that you've noticed? I mean, for one thing, just the increase, right?
Absolutely. You know, since pre-COVID, the number of test optional institutions has doubled, and it's actually probably now getting close to 2,000. And if we say there's about 4,000 plus institutions in the United States, it's gone from a little less than a quarter now to about half of those institutions are offering some type of test optional. And of course, all of us who've been in the business for a long time see how that can be, you know, there's advantages to that, right? I mean, we've understood the different biases that the standardized tests may have against certain groups of students. We've all known students, including I had a son who just wasn't a good test taker. And, you know, I was in a position that I could take him to test prep, et cetera, and those things all helped him, but still was never going to have a test score that probably really represented what he could do to colleges. Mm-hmm. But for colleges, even whether they were utilizing very holistic means of admissions, et cetera, the test score, along with a GPA and curriculum, were always providing a fairly significant amount of quantitative data that a school could understand that would say, here is this student's likelihood to perform well at my institution. And now that's not there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know when I worked at Reed, which was my first institution, and, you know, this is the case for many institutions, there were certain groups that were underrepresented that we really wanted to admit if we could at all. But there were certain test scores under which, and we didn't count test scores as much for them because we knew about the bias. That being said, based on our research, below a certain level gave us real concerns about ability to graduate. And that had been based on research, you know, that wasn't based on, it was like below this certain level, it's not just bias, there seems to be a weakening of ability to get yourself to completion, you know, to graduation.
Absolutely, Sally. And there's no question about it. There, you know, institutions are trying to do two things during the admissions process, right? They're trying to build a community of learners, of students that really are consistent with their values, their tradition, their mission. They're really trying to do that. But they're also wanting to make sure that the student can come and be successful, right? You admit students to hopefully ultimately graduate that student. That's why we have that process. And so you want to make sure that they can do the work. And institutions have, as you said, based off of research, usually some type of regression equation, et cetera, that included GPAs or weighted GPAs, some factor that would maybe include curriculum, but then test scores also usually entered into that algorithm so that they knew where was the place that a student may not be able to be successful, even if they were from an underserved population, an underrepresented population, or a student who just might not be able to test well. But, so those were very important parts of building that class. And, I remember, and again, you've been in this business since '92, it was helpful on the other side for both students and counselors, because you had the scattergrams, you had the median 50%, students at this institution usually score an SAT of between 1100 and 1260. There's certainly 25% of the classes testing above that, 25% below, and then a GPA. So you could sit down with a student and say, here's where you're likely to fall. And that factor, I think, you and I were talking again right before the call when I woke up and I was looking at my Facebook Saturday about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, and a lot of the large public institutions that are now test optional, which many thought they would never ever go test optional, are test optional. And on the counselor part of Facebook was outcry saying, I don't understand the choices. How is this happening? I don't know what's going on. And I thought to myself, exactly what we're talking about today is going test optional is good in a lot of ways, but it has actually increased the amount of uncertainty for institutions trying to figure out what students are going to be successful. But likewise for you and hundreds of students and families, it's also like, well, if I don't submit a score, if I do submit a score, where am I? And I really felt for all those counselors who were just saying, I did my best to advise a student, and now what do I tell them?
Exactly. Because GPA is really not a very useful marker. Like a lot of people think GPA is everything, but I'm like, no, I mean, the difference between a student who took AP physics versus AP psychology, it's the same grade points, totally different level of rigor, and colleges acknowledge that. So that kind of thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, then you get into whether there was grade inflation or, there's so many other factors. And then you're looking at students who may not have had an opportunity to engage a rigorous curriculum or as regular. So again, how do you do? And those are things that institutions have been trying to go through with a holistic process. I was actually at the University of Michigan when the court cases came down in 2003. And again, where a large public institution went to holistic admissions, and us trying to explain that. And again, for many students and counselors trying to listen to us explain this new admissions process, it was like, wow, you have made what was clear very cloudy for us. And that's existed. And in some ways, is it even more cloudy? But, speaking from somebody who was on the side of it at the institution, who's not only just wanting to build a class, but also retain a class. The question to institutions, as you're saying, is you might not have test scores now. And GPA is questionable, right, in terms of its validity. And again, the various validity between high schools or students that are applying. So what factors do they look at within an admissions application that help them say, I have confidence that this student can come here and be successful at that institution? And that's really a challenge, but there is advanced analytics. There are advanced analytics that can start helping institutions answer that question.
So let's dig into that. I mean, what kinds of things did institutions? I mean, for me at a small liberal arts and sciences college, it wasn't hard for me to imagine how they did it. A lot of them had been, Bowdoin went test optional. How long ago? 40 years ago?
Yeah.
I don't even know, but they've got plenty of data. They know what they're doing.
Right.
But these larger public institutions, the staff per student, it just has to be overwhelming. They can't do, my guess, and I only worked at private institutions, but I just can't imagine that they've got the staff to do the kind of deep dive. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but to do the kind of deep dive into each application that a small liberal arts or kind of some of these private institutions did. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
No, you're spot on. And again, in that piece that on the Facebook, some counselors at some of these publics came on and just said, we're having to get through these applications. What we were able to do, because actually when I was at the University of Delaware, we went test optional in 2016. for Delaware students. Again, understanding the bias of the test scores on certain populations and wanting to make sure those populations saw an open door and really knew that they had an open door to our institution. So we added some additional short answer questions that tried to get at some non-cognitive factors like, the grit determinants, things like that. But you're exactly right. How much additional time do you have now to read 2 or 3 additional short answer questions? And can you do that? And that was for 25,000 applications. I'm in the state of Michigan. I think the University of Michigan got 60,000 applications this year. So how in the world could they add more written questions? What we've done with the company that I work for now with advanced analytics is we've helped them actually look at other factors that include sometimes distance from campus, which are like really soft figures, but can often help you understand what that student's likelihood of success is. We're able to overlay some census data on top of those. And I want to emphasize, because as you know, there's been a lot of talk about the dangers of advanced artificial intelligence in terms of admissions processes or retention processes. And absolutely, if you totally rely on just the data and you're not intervening with human judgment that determines the goals, the institution's mission, again, they can potentially skew you towards ways that are not what you want to do in terms of your role to serve a broader society. So, but there are those other factors. Sometimes, class rank is, but as you know, less than 50% of high schools use class rank. So there are ways to dig in, and each institution, that's the key, is a little bit different in terms of what factors might be best useful for that institution.
Yeah, I mean, class rank is always an interesting one because I think that it's another flawed measure. And I kind of think this may seem a little off topic, but I think it's worth it to kind of think about how test scores can be useful if used correctly, but they were essentially, I think, to a large degree being misused, right? Like, yes. I think it's fair for an institution to say, like an MIT or something like that, to say, like, if you don't have a 1200, you're probably not going to be successful here. But to make a distinction between a 1500 and a 1550, it's meaningless, absolutely, completely meaningless.
You're exactly right. And that's where, again, especially in the selective publics or privates that are test optional, that you hope that they're taking the time to really, as you did at Reed, to really understand, again, that student's context. That's so important in the admissions process, is to understand the context of that student. And because there are many flawed factors, none of them are perfect. Test scores, I always said test scores were useful, again, what you just talked about, within a context of understanding context. How are you going to utilize it? Is it informing it, or is it driving the process? If it's informing it, great. If it's driving, that test score is driving the process, then maybe we have a problem. But if you're able to look at that and then able to look at other factors that you get through the admissions file and weigh those, then you can probably make decisions. But we still get to this issue, especially now that so many institutions are test optional and so many more students are applying test optional, of predictability, because there's not a lot of good quantitative things to go out to students or counselors and say, if a student does this, if a student does that, then we're not guaranteeing admissions, but they're going to be quote unquote competitive, or they're going to be highly competitive, or they're not going to be as competitive, but they're still, there may be other factors, all those things that go into what you've done for, 30 years. And, but so that's where I recommend students, if a school is saying that they're test optional, say, I think students need to be empowered and put the schools on, understand those guidelines. So if I don't submit a test score, and how will you look at my file differently than a student who does submit it? What other factors of my application might you look at or weigh differently if I don't test score? So that you at least have some understanding of what, if an institution has developed one of these other metrics that's helping them inform their admissions process, what is it? So that we're at least being transparent. And I've always argued for trying to be as transparent as we can be to students, counselors, et cetera, so that we're not increasing anxiety and very anxious filled environment, right?
Yeah. I think transparency really is, I do not know what's causing that echo, but things will sound better now. So I think transparency is what it's all about. It's not always easy to be transparent or to explain it in a way that people who aren't part of the process understand it, but really transparency is what it's all about. So we need to kind of, we need to wrap things up now. Do you have any last statement or last piece of advice for students or colleges or universities?
Well, I think first for colleges and universities, you need to start doing the hard work, using advanced predictive analytics to really understand what other factors, if you don't have test scores, will help you create a class that you have confidence that is going to be successful. If you determine additional factors, then I call on you to be transparent with students, families, counselors, so that they understand what other factors are going into the process. If you're going to add additional questions, okay, we'll say we're going to add additional, and these are the type of things that we're looking for in those type of questions. And for students, again, I think be empowered. Ask, don't just say, well, they're test optional, because that's not going to help you. What does that really mean? Are there other factors? Do the best. And all universities, because I've done it before at college panels, at high schools throughout the United States, we're always going to say there is no formula, where there's no recipe. But still, they should be able to provide some level of clarity that they now are missing, they're maybe missing, without having a predictable test band that was based off of almost all their students submitting test scores. So.
All right. Thank you so much, Chris. This was really helpful, really enlightening. And I'm sure that our audience is going to appreciate it too. So, all right.
Thank you to you and again, all of them for the work they do to help our students find great fits and have great starts to the next step of their life. Thanks, Sally.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. All right. We're going to take a short break. And when we return, I'll be talking with Megan Stubendek of Arbor Bridge.